Hey everyone, welcome. I wanted to share some things about what you could expect throughout this month of April to hopefully give you a sense of where we're heading over the next few weeks. All right, so essentially what I want to share today is introducing this idea of a logic model. Some of you may be familiar with that term, others may not. What I think you're going to hear is a lot of redundancy between logic models, the results framework that I introduced from ASF recently, and then these getting to outcomes framework. So hopefully, again, it's not overly redundant, but you'll just start to see, and if it doesn't make sense in one model, it will in another. So, and then I'll share a couple of just reminders about upcoming dates and housekeeping items too. All right, so the last time I spoke, I explained that this would sort of be the overall progression of the year. And we're still sitting right now kind of at this first step of defining the needs and the goals. This week, we're going to focus more on clarifying the goals through drafting what we call the result statement. And your result statement is going to continue to evolve through April and into early May. So don't be intimidated by kind of putting something on paper. Know that it is going to change. Later this month, for instance, we're going to also be able to move into the second step about developing our flexible approach by looking for evidence-based practices of how other organizations and people have achieved that same goal that you have. So again, your result statement, you're going to start asking yourself, what does success look like for your project, and put that into some words, try to quantify it. Then we're going to be looking for methods that have created that same success for others. I decided not to actually spend too much time on this today because I do want to come back to it more in depth. But I think we need later this month to continue to kind of ask this question of how can I earn trust at my site and with my participants? And I've got some materials I'm going to bring in, not only from Brene Brown, but also from Stephen Covey called, there's a book he wrote, The Speed of Trust. Anyway, it's got some great stuff I want to share. And then later this month, we'll also be starting to think about communication skill building and making sure that you can be a good advocate for your project and able to clearly communicate about it. So logic models, though, is kind of the main topic I wanted to tell you about today. And that's really going to be focused on this idea of understanding how to plan, design, implement, and evaluate a project. So in brief, logic models include these components you see below. It's just a systematic and oftentimes visual, sometimes they'll use these kind of flowchart images as a way to show relationships between what it's going to take to operate your program. Those are called inputs, the activities that you plan, in other words, the methodology you're going to use, how much you do, so that's also called outputs, and then the changes or results that you hope to achieve. So these four things, inputs, activities, outputs, and outcomes, are something that there's a lot of information out there about it. I wanted to share with you something from Alice Runke, who did a presentation on this that I found to be really helpful. The presentation, though, is like an hour and a half, so I've tried to find like an 8-minute clip that we can watch. Where I think we are right now is in this outputs and outcome stage. So we're going to come back and think more about the activity and inputs later. Because at ASF, we actually use what's called a reverse logic model. So we're going to come in from the outputs or outcomes side and think about outputs, and then select the activities, those methods, those interventions that you're going to do. So again, this is a little bit different way of thinking about it. A lot of times when people, think about doing a project, they're like, I want to provide, this service to individuals. We'll get there, right? Like we'll figure out what service you need to provide once we know what the outcome is that you're seeking. And then once we can agree on that, then, again, we'll work backwards. So let's watch this video clip of a presentation. We'll be watching her explain the difference between outputs and outcomes, where she gives several examples that I think will help you start to clarify this difference. The video clip again is going to be about 8 minutes long, and then we'll come back and consider how this applies to your ASF project. So let's see here.
Able to just say what we did in our programs, quantify that, and funders and donors, we would say in our grants or in our funding requests, we'd say, we're going to do this for this.
Let's see here.
This many people for this many hours. And then at the end of the year, we'd say, we did this for this many people for this many hours. And if that's what we did and we met our goals, and funders were like, great, that's awesome. But now there's that shift, and this is a really rude question, but be prepared for it if you're talking to a funder. They'll say, so what? So what that you did that? Did it make a difference in people's lives? So that's where those outcomes come in. Right? So again, we used to be able to say that we taught I'm going to enroll 82 people in my.
Okay, sorry guys. I think when I muted myself, it muted the video. So let me go back a minute to make sure you saw this.
We developed. So I just want to have one more little slide here to kind of emphasize what those differences are. So again, in the nonprofit world, we used to be able to just say what we did in our programs and quantify that. And funders and donors, we would say in our grants or in our funding requests, we'd say, we're going to do this for this many people for this many hours. And then at the end of the year, we'd say, we did this for this many people for this many hours. And if that's what we did and we met our goals, and funders were like, great, that's awesome. But now there's that shift, and this is a really rude question, but be prepared for it if you're talking to a funder. They'll say, so what? So what that you did that? Did it make a difference in people's lives? So that's where those outcomes come in, right? So again, we used to be able to say that we taught 52 job training classes to 100 people. And we're still going to have to report that we provided 52 job training classes to 100 people. But now funders are saying, well, I want to know how many people, because of those classes, had an increased job performance and maintained their job or were promoted in their jobs or whatever. Like, what difference did those job training classes make? Or we used to be able just to say, I'm providing 100 hours of counseling to veterans with PTSD. And again, important, but now funders are asking, well, so what that you provided that counseling, how many of those veterans actually had decreased anxiety or whatever because of that counseling that you provided, right? So I'll just do one more. We used to be able to say, well, I'm going to enroll 82 people in my health and wellness program. Again, we're still going to have to report how many people we enrolled in our health and wellness program, but now they want to know, well, how many people got healthier and increased their health status, right? So there's just that shift now to kind of, and it's a rude question, but just be prepared. They say, so what that you're going to do that? What difference is it going to make? And so as we go through this change, this model of short, mid, and long-term outcomes, we're going to measure that change. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that step by step. So short-term outcomes are generally the first changes that our clients or participants experience because they've been interacting in our program. And they're usually some sort of change in knowledge or skills or motivations or attitudes because they're learning something from us through our interactions. So in our Drug-Free Moms and Babies program, again, the short-term outcome, if participants participate in these weekly individual and group counseling sessions, then what can we expect them to change in the short term? That they're going to increase their skills and motivations to become sober. So the first step in that change that we need from these women who are addicted to drugs and alcohol, the first step we need for them to change is that they start to realize that they and develop those skills and attitudes that help them feel that recovery is possible. Okay, because recovery is not going to be possible if somebody doesn't have the skills to do things and kind of that motivation and that sort of thing. So in the short term, we would expect that they would increase their skills and motivations. The midterm outcomes generally link your short-term outcomes to your long-term outcomes, and they're generally some sort of change in behavior that comes from that new knowledge or skills or attitudes that were learned in the short term. All right, so in our example, the short-term outcomes, if they increase their skills and motivations to become sober, then that behavior change that we're looking at is then they will quit using the drugs. Okay, and that's the behavior change that we're looking for in the program. Our long-term outcomes are usually those kind of ultimate outcomes that we're looking for people to achieve, generally tied back to whatever the problem, situation, need was that we were addressing in the first place. And those long-term outcomes are generally some sort of meaningful changes in their condition or status. So in our example, if participants quit using drugs, then the long-term outcome would be that they deliver drug-free babies. And so you can see that long-term connected right back to where I said 19% of babies were born with drugs in their system. So you can see the long-term outcome connects right to that now we have babies being born drug-free, which is what we're trying to do. So notice a couple of things with this, that these are written from a client change perspective. So they're written from the change in the people that we serve, okay? Not from our own perspective of what we provide, right? So when you're writing your outcomes, especially if this is kind of new, always use the term, whatever term it is you use, if it's participants or clients or patients or students or whatever, that you say participants will what, because that just helps us make that mind shift into writing out something that says how participants will change, okay? The second thing that you'll see in this is that these right here, these outcomes, they're just statements of change. When we get to the next column, we're going to talk about how we're going to measure that change. But this first column in the outcomes are just the statements of how we want people to change over time. Just to connect this to a theory of change, you might hear that with some of the funders you're looking at, and they're asking for what your theory of change is. And so this really is a theory of change. It's like, what has to happen first for people to make that longer term change that you're seeking in your program? So what has to happen first, and what has to happen second, and what ultimate change are you trying to make happen? So, this really is a theory of change. It's how do we get these women who walk into this OBGYN for prenatal care addicted to drugs, how do we get them to delivery drug-free? And so there's a process to that, right? And this is the process. So if theory of change is not something that your funders are worried about, don't worry about it. But if it's something that you're hearing or that kind of thing, I'm saying it's, with certain funders at different times that they're asking for your theory of change. And this is your theory of change. This is how people move from their current situation to the outcome you're trying to achieve with them. So I'm going to stop. stop here for a second with our second poll question.
Okay, I hope that was helpful and that the audio worked after I realized I couldn't mute myself. I do want to go back and share a few more things about how I think this relates to ASF. So let me get that pulled up. Just a moment here. So essentially right now, your academic mentors could be really good resources for you to use as you're trying to determine what can I achieve in a year or less. That's what you're facing, right? So your project will not begin before June at the earliest. We're taking these first few months to plan. You're going to end, let's just aim for the end of March 2022. So in that time frame, what can you do? It really is going to be those short and medium term outcomes. So if you were working with a program like she was just describing, those moms may not give birth at the point at which, you were doing. So kind of backing it up and figuring out, okay, what are some of the earlier indicators that we would know a mom was, going to be successful in being clean by the time her baby was born. So use your academic mentors, if you've identified him or her yet, to help you find research to determine this. So your mentor may not have the answer, right? But they can help you figure out where can you go to start to get that kind of information. Likewise, your site mentors or these other stakeholders that you're talking to right now could be good resources for determining if the goals are realistic. So they're the people on the ground already implementing similar programs to what you're trying to do. So it would be important to know things like how long do clients typically interact with their programs? I was meeting with Shan yesterday. I'm sure she wouldn't mind me using her as an example. And we were talking about sort of these financial literacy goals. So first of all, what does it look like for someone to be more financially literate? And then how long does it take? Based on her experience doing this kind of work in Texas, she told me it takes usually about 6 months for them to really see not only people's mindsets to change, but really some of those behaviors to start to be implemented. So obviously, Shan is not going to want to find a partner who works with clients on like a drop-in basis where people might show up one time for, so if it's a shelter, for instance, we were discussing how a lot of shelters, it's their goal. They're just kind of that emergency service, and then they're going to get the client housed and put into another agency or location. So Shan is going to need to find a client who works with, or a organization who works with clients for 6 months or more at a time. Likewise, you can ask your sites, have they tried to achieve this outcome previously, and if so, what was the result? Later this month, we're going to be looking for evidence-informed practices to see, who else has been effective in doing this, what did they do, and kind of these questions of like intensity, frequency, and duration. How many points of contact does it take? So Shan was able to tell me 6 months, but there's probably more to that story, right? I'm sure she's going to be able to figure out, well, yeah, it takes 6 months if you're meeting whatever, like they need, let's say 24 contact hours of information and 10 hours of coachings or one-on-one assistance. And so maybe that's where she comes up with the idea later to kind of do a weekly educational workshop to get those 24 hours of content and knowledge delivered. And then she's going to do those coaching sessions. And maybe she expects to touch base with them every other week for 30 minutes to an hour each time in order to help them individually achieve their financial goals. So again, I don't expect you to know this now, but I want to give you a preview that this is what we're going to be asking and looking at literature to find out later. How much of something do you need to do in order to be effective? And if you think about it for a second, this is answering that outputs question that we were just looking at earlier. It's the how much. It's the question of quantifying what services you're doing to what degree. So this is where, and I hate the fact that like we talk so much about outcomes in ASF, and one of the things that we report out on a lot is the number of service hours. And I'm very aware of the fact that, like, that's not an outcome, right? That is an output. We can explain sort of how many hours of service fellows are achieving, but ultimately our outcomes are about what y'all learn about project planning and evaluation and about your ability to apply it successfully in your projects. But anyway, all to say that sometimes, as Alice also mentioned in the video, outputs are something that you'll want to report out on. We just don't want to end there. That's not going to be kind of the be all end all of what we're seeking. So in terms of this getting to outcomes model that we've also been, saying we're going to kind of use throughout this year, the steps are also very similar. Conducting a needs assessment, choosing what problems to focus on. You're there now, right? Check. Step 2, identifying goals for the program, the people you want to target, and the desired outcomes or objectives. Perfect. So that's, again, this question of what will change, for whom, by how much, and by when. That's your result statement, right? So see, we're seeing a lot of similarities in these different models, different ways of essentially doing the same work. So when we gather at orientation, you're actually going to review each other's result statements, and you're going to ask those questions. You're going to ask yourself when you read someone's, do I understand what will change, for whom, by how much, and by when? And if you can't answer those questions, you're going to give each other feedback to say, like, well, what about this part, or what about this? And you'll be able to help each other continue to refine them. Step 3, next up, we're going to start looking for those existing programs and best practices. We are not going to reinvent the wheel, right? Like, you don't have time to create something and implement it and see if it works and adapt it. I mean, you do, but it's not going to be quite as effective. If we can find an existing program, we will be much wiser by using that program that has already been shown to work. And let me just tell you, it's going to be hard enough just to do that. So don't feel like you are skirting out of any of the challenge. Then next, we're going to look for whether or not that program really already fits our community and our population, or whether or not we might need to adapt it some. So this is going to include making sure that we aren't duplicating services, or kind of providing something that's incompatible with the community and their kind of interest and values. So one thing that the getting to outcomes researchers suggest is you can assess whether or not your community is ready to accept your program by talking to community leaders. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Again, I think that as we move forward, we'll primarily be using this language about result statements, outcomes. But again, there's a lot of overlap between kind of our results framework and this logic model approach. So we'll be kind of weaving the two things together. A few housekeeping items. I realized in conversation with someone that I had made 2 mistakes. One, I don't think I was clear enough about the need for you to be tracking your hours right now. The time that you spend researching your topic, looking for data, finding your mentors, all of this is administrative time that you're spending. If you've been fortunate enough to also get to be, quote, face-to-face, whatever that looks like, through in person, through via video, phone, with potential site mentors and such, then great, you're also already earning direct service hours. But either way, I know you're putting in the time and effort, and we want to recognize that. We want to credit you for that. So I have just uploaded a place where you can submit your hours for March. If you are not already tracking those things, don't worry, we're just going to give it our best guesstimate at this point. Look back at your calendar, figure out roughly what you spent, turn it in for March, and then for April now, just start tracking it. I did have an assignment about 2 weeks ago about timekeeping, so go back and look at that as I tried to provide some helpful ways that there's some app-based stuff that you can use that I think will make it easy to track your time moving forward. So sorry about the miscommunication and for the delay just in getting that on Google Classroom, but you can now submit your hours for March, and then at the end of April, I'll ask you to do the same for April and onward. next Saturday, or this Saturday, is when I'll be meeting up with most of you to get your pictures and to hand off some ASF goodies. Please bring your HR paperwork if you haven't already mailed that to me. And if you can attend this Saturday between 9 to 10, let me know. I will say I think I'm going to meet up with one person this Friday at 3 p.m. I'd like to try to, be as efficient as possible. So if you can't do 4:10, I'll probably suggest one or two other options where I know I'm going to be meeting with others. And then I wanted to propose a slight time shift to our orientation. I know originally I had said, hold May 1st, doing it virtual. It's just hard to keep our attention and energy up for a whole day. So I had originally maybe suggested 10 to 11:30, 1 to 2:30, 4 to 5:30. I would like to request that we do away with that mid-afternoon, the 1 to 2:30 slot, and instead start a little bit earlier. We had some time conflicts, and I think this will hopefully help it work better. So let me know if there's a conflict. If I don't hear from you, then I will assume that this also works. These, again, will be virtual. Speaking of kind of that, decision of virtual versus in person, I've reevaluated. It looks like most of our schools have started to release information about when they plan to go back in person, and fall, summer, but some are fall. And so I want to respect the school schedules. It looks like our latest school starts back on August the 26th. So we'll continue with our plans for, June and July and August to be virtual. And then September, I'm really excited that our fall retreat, it looks like we will be, following their standards and still able to meet in person. So really excited about that. So you see, I shared this slide before. Just want to show you, you're continuing to make progress. We've done a lot of those introductory steps. In a few weeks, you'll attend the celebration of service where you'll be introduced virtually at that event. Then we'll be gathering together for orientation. And one thing I added here is your project plan. So we'll talk more about that later, but just know you are already working on it. Whether you know it or not, you are building the components, and that will be due June 1st before I then meet with you one-on-one in June to review that plan. So that's kind of what's coming up over the next few months. As always, let me know if I can do something or if anything doesn't make sense. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing many of you this weekend. All right, take care. Bye.